Hey, Bastish B here for 64K, and welcome to another video special.
The Commodore 64 Multiversion Arcade Special Number 2.
And welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to have a look at some more Multiversion arcade conversions to the Commodore 64. If you haven't seen the first episode, I check out 12 different variations of this, and I'll leave links in the video description for you to check that out. And on today's episode we're going to take a look at another 8 different variations of arcade ports, both US and UK versions, on the Commodore 64. But before we go any further, let's take a full look at all the listings of all the games we're going to look at today. Mario Bros. US Atari Soft version was complete in 1984 but unreleased officially, with Ocean releasing a UK version in 1987. Donkey Kong got a US Atari Soft version in 1983, with Ocean again making their own version in 1986 for the UK. Crystal Castles got a version by Thundervision that got released officially in Italy, with the cancelled Atari Soft version seeing the light of day eventually in 1986 through US Gold in the UK. Wizard of War got 2 versions by Commodore themselves in 1982 and 1983, one made in the US and the other in Japan. Skyshark got a 1988 release in the US by Taito, with the UK getting an 87 release by Firebird retitled Flying Shark. Congo Bongo got 2 US versions released, an 83 cartridge version and an 85 disc version. Zaxxon got a US release by Synapse Software and a Sega cartridge version, both in 1984. Plus, Super Zaxxon got 2 US versions as well, with a Heesware version and a Sega version released in 1984.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Welcome to my rapid fire look at classic PC Engine and MSX games. New series available now. And one final note here before we get started, these are all officially licensed games from the original run of the Commodore 64 from 1982 to 1993. This video does not contain any newer unofficial releases that have been released in the past couple of years. And now, let's go over to our first game. With the launch of the C64 in 1982, Commodore themselves put out 2 very different versions of the Bally Midway maze-style shooter Wizard of War, which was a runaway hit in the arcades when it originally released in 1981. So let's start with the first version, which is known as the Ultimax release. It launched in 1982 to coincide with the exclusive Japanese Commodore Max machine, which was, for simplicity's sake, basically a budget C64 with only 2 kilobytes of RAM as opposed to 64 and reduced functionality on all fronts. Commodore published a bunch of games on cartridge for the system, mostly developed by Japanese company HAL Laboratory, who were formed in 1980 in Tokyo, Japan. They'd later become a huge third-party supporter of Nintendo, from the Famicom right up to the Switch. They developed a whole bunch of Max games, such as Le Mans, Omega Race, and the first version of Wizard of War in 1982. All Commodore Max cartridges are compatible with a regular C64, which is why it's included here, because simply Commodore published this version originally in the West for the launch of the C64, even though it was actually a Max version. So once their second attempt at the arcade hit stores in 1983, there was no real way to know which version you were gonna buy. You could either hit the 1983 jackpot version or the extremely inferior Max version. Game publishing was on a whole nother level back then. So let's get back to the Max version, which, to put it mildly, is awful. Mostly obviously due to hardware limitations. They simply did their best with what little they had. The basic game structure is the same: blast all the monsters in each maze as the action gets faster and faster. This version omits the arcade's best feature though, its 2-player co-op mode, so it's only single player. There are only a handful of maze variations, and the sound overall makes the ZX Spectrum seem like a movie composition by Vangelis. Plus the graphics have no animation, again, probably a hardware limitation. Plus it generally runs too fast, making the gameplay feel completely out of whack with the arcade original. It's basically the version you hoped you didn't get when you handed over your hard-earned pocket money at your local software shop. There is also a slightly altered version of the Max release for Europe as well, but the end result is still terrible overall. Fortunately, in 1983, Commodore wisely took another stab at the game, developed this time on a real C64 using all its superiority over the Macs, and the end result is truly an excellent version of the Bally Midway arcade classic. This conversion manages to not only replicate the arcade's graphics style perfectly, but nails the gameplay 100%. It really does feel like the arcade game at home. Plus it has the all-important two-player co-op action intact, the big loud sound effects and blown out music from the arcade, and the level ends are all here. If you had access to the Magic Voice speech cartridge for your C64, you got a bonus of speech just like the arcade. For a 1983 arcade port, this is impressive on so many levels, especially on the gameplay front. Overall, I would give the Ultimax Japanese version a 2 out of 10 and the real US C64 a 9. It's a must play of the early C64 back catalog. Donkey Kong hit the arcades in 1981 courtesy of Nintendo and featured the first appearance of Mario and Donkey Kong, Nintendo staples from then on out. Before the Famicom and the NES for that matter gained real strides in the gaming industry, Nintendo allowed ports of their early arcade games such as Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong to pretty much any system available, and the C64 got 2 official versions in 1983 and 1986. The first one was made by AtariSoft, who did a huge amount of ports to the C64 of popular arcades during the 82 to 84 period. Check out my video covering all of their efforts in full detail. This version of Donkey Kong hit the C64 in 1983 and is a really impressive adaptation of the arcade. Like a lot of arcade conversions, the game looks a bit stretched out due to the differences in the arcade and the home aspect ratios, but graphically it's very faithful to its big brother with nice, simple animation and good interpretations of the arcade's mindless music, and the sound effects are close as well. But the most important aspect here is they really nailed the gameplay. It feels very much in line with the arcade. The NTSC version is faster, matching the arcade speed. The PAL version is slower, but also makes it a little bit easier to play. Either way, it's a job well done, and another great job by AtariSoft. In 1986, for reasons I can't 100% confirm, this arcade was produced again for the C64 by UK software house Ocean, and despite some really mediocre reviews at the time, it plays pretty good. The aspect ratio is more traditional PAL format, which may be the whole reason for the redo, as the NTSC AtariSoft version wasn't modified for Europe when launched. The graphics are very nice, much more detailed with a lot of extra animation everywhere and better use of color. The music matches the arcade better, but the sound effects are a bit annoying. I prefer the basic sounds of the AtariSoft version, but it's all subjective in the end, and it includes the little intermissions between levels. The biggest difference here is in the gameplay. As nice looking as the Ocean version is, it doesn't feel like the arcade. The jumping and the speed just don't feel right, but it's not terrible by any means, just different. This version, generally speaking, gets a lot of flack, but really it's pretty good, and with a few small tweaks it probably could have been the superior version overall. But I'd give the US AtariSoft version an 8 out of 10, simply over gameplay, and this UK version 7 out of 10. Next was Congo Bongo, an isometric platformer that released in 1983 in the arcades by Sega. The C64 got 2 versions. The original came out in 1983, released by Sega on cartridge, and it was completely remade again in 1985 by the UK company US Gold for disc. The goal of the game is simply to get to Congo Bongo on the screen without dying. The arcade featured 4 different isometric levels to survive. The first version by Sega is a very pared down interpretation of the arcade original, with a slightly different angle to the action, and it only features 2 of the arcade's 4 stages, and in that respect it feels more like an Atari 2600 port. The graphics are very chunky with some high-res characters. It moves at a pretty good pace, even though the angle makes judging jumps sometimes hit and miss. You also got a simple jungle tune in the background, and big loud arcade style sound effects that work pretty well. Only problem is you can basically complete this game in about 1 minute before it loops. The C64 was capable of so much more, which is probably why the 1985 US Gold version was made, this time on disc, allowing all the extra levels to be loaded in. So the game now features all 4 arcade levels for the complete experience. The angle of play is yet again slightly different from both previous version and the the arcade, but still gives the isometric feeling of the original. The graphics have had a major upgrade and are way more detailed and colourful, and the sound effects are more in line with the arcade version. It plays pretty well with simply needing to get used to the jump distance. Having all 4 levels makes it feel like a complete game as opposed to the 83 version, which feels more like a tech demo. Overall, the original 83 US version gets a 4 out of 10, with this way more accurate and complete UK version getting a 7 out of 10. Next was a conversion of Mario Bros., another Nintendo arcade platformer from 1983. The C64 got 2 versions, although only one was officially released. The 1983 Atari Soft version was complete but never officially shipped, because at the time of its launch in 1984, Atari collapsed financially, and the Atari Soft division was disbanded, plus all the completed games for various systems were simply abandoned. However, due to the C64's crazy pirating scene, the game got out anyway, and most of us probably had this game back then on some sort of dodgy bootleg disc. I know I did. There was also the completely remade version that was released in 1987 for Europe, again by Ocean Software. In the game, you simply have to defeat creatures that have invaded the underground plumbing station as Mario and Luigi. You just have to murder these things. It's as simple as that. It's simple, and for me, even back then, it was nowhere near as engaging as Donkey Kong was. And over to the Atari Soft version, which offered single and 2-player co-op action just like the arcade. The graphics represent the arcade quite well, very much like the Donkey Kong conversion. Small details are missing, but the all-important gameplay is very much in line with the original. Knock out those creatures before booting them off the screen, and you can also use that power button to take out an entire screen of enemies a few times each round. There's also the bonus coin stages as well. The sound effects are also loud, just like the arcade, with the inertia of your running set just right to capture the feel and gameplay again of that arcade original quite accurately. Ocean released its European version in 1987. It also has the all-important 2-player co-op gameplay, but everything else just doesn't feel quite right. The inertia on the running is way overdone, difficulty ramps up way too fast in this game, making it annoying to play almost initially. The sound effects are good, but again, the simplicity of the Atari Soft version just seems better, and I really don't like the overuse of the kind of grey color scheme in the graphics. It's a really weird choice and doesn't look as good as the 83 version. Overall, it's okay, but when it comes down to it, the 1983 US version gets a 7 out of 10 because of superior gameplay, with this UK Ocean version getting a 5 out of 10 for me personally.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
The Commodore 64 Arcade Multiversion Special.
Crystal Castles was next, an isometric maze dot gobbler styled arcade by Atari, released in 1983. You play a bear who has to simply collect all the gems in a level while avoiding the enemies. It's basically isometric, fast as hell Pac-Man. The C64 got 2 ports. Strangely though, both were complete but remained unreleased for a few years, before seeing official releases by other third parties. First was a version made by a company called Thundervision. This was their only game, made independently of Atari. Once it was complete though, around 1983 they submitted it to Atari Soft hoping to get it released officially through them. It was rejected and the game sat on a shelf until, and I cannot confirm this date 100%, around 1984 it was released on an Italian compilation called Turbo Games No. 5 as Castelli. How this happened and how they dodged a copyright lawsuit is not known, but it was out on the shelves technically. This game is a pretty good representation of the arcade. It's super fast, maybe a bit too fast, but then again so was the arcade game. The graphics are pretty good with its isometric depth captured well, as are the creature enemies, which are pretty varied just like the arcade game, and it has decent sound effects and a few short musical pieces for music ends and such. It plays well despite the crazy speed, although getting on the elevators are pretty tricky as you simply move too fast and always overstep them. It is a pretty good conversion and was probably rejected by Atari Soft because they had their own one
anyone complete at that point, but that's only a guess. And like I previously mentioned, the Atari Soft division was disbanded in 1984 and all completed games were left in the dust. Fortunately, a few years later in 1986, UK company US Gold bought the completed Atari Soft version and officially published it in the UK and Europe under the name Crystal Castles, Diamond Plateaus and Space. This again is a pretty accurate conversion with decent graphics, capturing the arcade well, and the speed is fast but not manic Thundervision fast, which makes it slightly more playable. The sound effects are almost the same, but there's just a whole lot more of them. Gameplay wise, it's easier to play due to the slightly reduced speed, and is another good conversion by Atari Soft, as long as you like the arcade original. Overall, I don't really have a preference here. Both do a good job as ports. It's not really an arcade I absolutely love, but as home conversions, they both are decent, and I'd give them both 6 out of 10. Zaxxon was released in the arcades at the tail end of 1981 by the soon-to-be arcade giants, Sega. Sega had up until that point a number of successful arcades, but Zaxxon would up the ante and put them at the top of the heap of one of the most popular arcade manufacturers of the 1980s. Not much is known about the development of Zaxxon itself, but it's often referred to as Sega's answer to Konami's Scramble, which itself was a massive arcade hit in 1981. The game was developed by two teams, one being Ikegami Tsushinki and Sega's in-house development team in Japan. It was completely unlike any shoot 'em up out there at the time, choosing to take an isometric viewpoint of the action, making the game immediately stand out from the crowd and giving the sense of 3D to the genre. The goal of the game is to fly over an enemy's base and shoot the hell out of everything, destroying as much of their base as humanly possible. Like Scramble, you are constantly running out of fuel, so you have to blast those fuel tanks to keep your ship afloat. You also have to use your shadow on the ground to determine how high and low you are, and use your lasers to shoot through the gaps to determine if you're in the right position to navigate through those small openings. You also get to fly through space, which are segues to the last part of the base where you face off against a giant boss character, Zaxxon itself. It's a pretty simple game concept in retrospect, but the extremely detailed isometric graphics with the bright blues and reds really caught your eye back then, and was one of the reasons that I actually gravitated to the arcade back in the day in the first place. Zaxxon also has the honor of being the first arcade game to get a TV commercial produced for it by Paramount Pictures.
In the two-dimensional world of video dots and dashes, flat blips and formless blobs, one video arcade game soars a dimension above the rest. Zaxxon! Experience the control as you climb and dive. Feel the power as you attack and evade. Discover a new level of excitement with the true feel of action in 3 dimensions. Zaxxon, from the master design engineers of Sega.
It no doubt helped out the game to become the massive hit that it was, and in the top 5 money-making arcades in 1982 in the US. Sega did, however, make use of the arcade engine for a couple of other releases, most notably Congo Bongo in 1983. And over on the C64 front, Zaxxon got 2 completely different versions made, which actually wasn't that uncommon back then, as seen by a lot of games, mainly arcade releases getting a US and UK version, as seen by Akari Warriors, 720 Degrees, and many other examples. But 2 US made versions was pretty odd though. The reason this happened was because of a man called Robert Crane, a former lawyer working at Sega during this period. He basically was a con artist and managed to double sell the rights to Zaxxon and made a quick buck on the side. That's the reason for a version by Sega on cartridge and a regular disc tape version released by Synapse Software. How he did this was by setting up a fake company called Universal Licensing, which acquired the Zaxxon license. Crane's friend Brian DePue pretended to be the Universal boss while Crane was using a pseudonym while sub-licensing the game to Synapse Software. He was literally writing to himself from Universal to Sega. This all resulted in the 2 versions, but more about this bizarre story a little bit later and its conclusion. For now, let's check out the 2 C64 versions of the original Zaxxon game, and we'll start with Sega's cartridge version. This attempt captures the look of the arcade game pretty well with big blue color tones and graphics that are a good facsimile of its big brother. The scrolling can be a little bit jerky at times, and there is quite a bit of sprite flickering, but not enough to affect the gameplay seriously. The sound is a bit of a mess though, with everything sounding like it's going through a washing machine, and it gets kind of annoying after a while. Plus there is no music at all. Gameplay though is fairly good, with the ship controlling well, but being able to determine the height is a little bit difficult in this version. But as far as the level structures go, it features everything from the arcade. The base destruction sequences, the space blasting segue, and the final encounter with the Zaxxon robot itself. It is very similar to Sega's upcoming version of Super Zaxxon. And on the flip side, you got Synapse Software's version, who gained the rights from Crane's Conjob, although they didn't know that at the time. Synapse weren't known for arcade conversions, even though a lot of their earlier stuff was of the arcade clone variety, but their excellent Fort Apocalypse and Blue Max put them on the map. Their version of Zaxxon would be very similar to their game Blue Max, maybe even using a modified engine, but whatever the case, it is by far the better version of the two. The game's muted color make it visually less appealing initially until you start to play it and realize the gameplay is vastly superior and feels extremely satisfying blasting stuff up. The sound effects are also quite good and very atmospheric, and judging the height of your ship is way easier than the Sega version. The mid-level space sequences also play much better and don't have any of the graphical glitches of Sega's one, and it is also fully intact with the complete arcade game on display for you to play. It's actually a really cool version from a company that really got swallowed by con jobs and legal pitfalls. And if you want to know more about Synapse, please check out my documentary on the company itself. And this is a weird case of US versus US versions. The Sega version is pretty decent. It's got a nice color scheme, but there's a lot of graphical glitches, and I'll give the game overall 6 out of 10. The second US version by Synapse Software is actually very good. I'd give it 8 out of 10. Despite its very muted color scheme, the gameplay is just vastly superior. Next was an arcade shoot 'em up I really loved back in the day called Flying Shark, or Sky Shark depending on the region, published by Taito in 1987 and developed by Shooter King's Toplan. The C64 got 2 versions, one for PAL formats made by Firebird and another completely different version for NTSC by Taito. The first version was released in 1987 by Firebird in the UK, not long after the arcade's debut. It was developed by a programming group called Catalyst Coders, who also did the C64 conversion of Super Sprint and the European version of Rampage. Both versions of this game are pretty difficult, so be prepared for a stiff challenge. Graphically, it does quite a good job replicating the arcade with lots of good animation. This version's biggest flaw though is its color scheme, which makes certain enemy bullets blend into the background, leading to a lot of unnecessary or unfair deaths. The enemy patterns and attacks are also pretty relentless, much more than the US version. The smart bomb here is, however, executed much better, blowing up a massive part of the screen compared to the US version. The music is a pretty good rendition of the arcade's main themes, and the sound effects also play at the same time, which I really like. The game is fast and brutal, and I like that they try to keep the arcade's aspect ratio by having the score and stats down the side, giving you more room to maneuver. This was the version I played as a kid, and despite its flaws, it's still pretty fun for an 8-bit version of this Toplan classic. In 1988, the US got its own completely different version, titled Sky Shark, as the US arcade version was renamed. It switched up the aspect ratio, putting the stats at the top of the screen and widening the sides, which is its biggest flaw overall, giving you much less room to dodge bullets. And man, do they come in fast at you. You're gonna die a lot, just like the UK version. The good part is the bullets are fully visible at all times, but your smart bomb is downgraded in size dramatically, which is really weird. Sound wise, you have the choice of either music or sound effects. You can't have both at the same time, but since it actually has a Tim Follin soundtrack, the choice is pretty easy. He does his own thing here and the results are fantastic, so crank up the volume. Overall, this is actually quite hard to choose the best one. You wish you could combine the best elements of both for the ultimate C64 version, but as it stands, I'd favor the US version, which I'd give an 8 out of 10 due to the visibility of the bullets and the Follin soundtrack, and the UK version gets a 7 out of 10. It's enjoyable, but just way too hard. Super Zaxxon blasted its way onto the arcade circuit at the end of 1982, about 1 year after the original. Its quick development time was due to the game using Sega's Zaxxon arcade board and the engine, and the fact that the game doesn't really stray much away from the original. In fact, you can almost see Super as an update or variation on the original. The biggest differences between the two are that Super runs faster, which in turn makes it a lot harder to play. There are also lots of new enemies to take out, and the graphics have added detail. The space battles are gone, and the Zaxxon robot you face at the end has been replaced by a dragon or Godzilla knockoff, maybe? You decide. The game definitely wasn't as popular as the original and resulted in the series abruptly ending, although later there were a few variations down the line, like 1987's Master System version called Zaxxon 3D, which switched up the view and used the Master System's 3D glasses, as well as Zaxxon Mother Base 2000 in 1995 on the 32X, although this was only named after Zaxxon for its US release and goes under different names in Europe and Japan, so it's not really seen as a continuation of the series. And if we have to look back, the original was so popular at the time, it was enough to get its own board game by Milton Bradley in 1982, which was pretty insane for the time. So just like with Zaxxon, the C64 got two different versions of the game, again the result of Crane's dodgy dealings, which we'll get to shortly. One version by Sega and the other by Heesware, or Human Engineered Software, both out in 1984. So let's again take a look at the Sega cartridge version first. For me, this is the lesser of the two versions. Visually it's a bit closer in look to the arcade, but the technical issues are all over the place in this one, which ruin it a bit. It's not terrible though. The graphics look pretty good overall, but the game suffers from some major sprite flickering and slowdown, which really affects the gameplay. It's also much harder in this version to judge your height, so flying through those tiny gaps is a real pain and results in a lot of accidental deaths. The sound effects are a bit messy, but they're still honestly way better than the next version. Just like the arcade though, it runs a bit faster but nowhere near the speed of that one, which is good because that actually ruined the arcade version for me personally. But moving from left to right is extremely fast and causes a lot of mistaken deaths. Sega's version definitely has issues, but it's still an okay conversion overall, if the next one didn't exist, that is. And again, why are there two versions of the same game on the same system? Well, good old tricky Robert Crane was up to his old dodgy deals once again. Crane, I guess, figured that his first con job worked so well, why not try it again? Which he did, but things went sideways this time. He got laid off from Sega right at the beginning of 1984, and this caused further complications for his scheme. He also already had two pseudonyms at his own shell company, Universal, that he was using for his fake contracts, but it all blew up in his face eventually, as his side hustles were figured out by the various parties involved, which resulted in Paramount, who were Sega's parent company in the US at the time, having to pay Heesware $200,000 so they could keep Super Zaxxon off the store shelves, so Synapse Software, who got the first part of Crane's con job, so they could actually market their own version of Zaxxon first and sell it without competing immediately with Heesware's sequel, which would have come out at the exact same time. Oh Bob, how did you honestly expect to get away with all this? Anyway, with all that aside, the Hees version of Super Zaxxon is definitely the superior version overall. It retains the arcade's intro sequence accompanied by a really rocking little Sid tune that sets the stage well. Graphically, it's a little bit different from the arcade's look, with Sega's version looking a little bit more accurate, but overall I like this one better, as all the graphical glitches are gone, no massive slowdown or sprite flickering. It does run a bit slower though, but judging height and the controls are way tighter and on point. It's just a pity it's got this really awful bell type whistling sound for the laser fire, which gets really annoying and grating very quickly. But besides that, it's quite an excellent version and actually plays better than the arcade it's based on. Zap 64 in the October 1985 issue murdered this version, giving it a paltry 57% overall, which I feel again is unfair. I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's definitely the better of the two Super Zaxxon versions on the C64 for sure. And another strange example of US versus US. In this case, I'd give the Sega version a solid 6 out of 10, it's not bad, but Heesware's version is vastly superior overall, and I'd give that an 8 out of 10, and is a highly recommended arcade conversion.
And that's it for another Multiversion special. I hope you enjoyed it. Links in the description for the previous episode so you can check that out if you never did. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B, for 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.